Hello and welcome to today's online IELTS lesson. I'm just going to share the lesson online and then we can begin. In today's lesson, we are going to be looking at how we can approach the writing task, part 2. Share, and there we go. So in this lesson, we are going to look at writing, part 2. In particular, what we're going to look at is a little bit more to do with structure, language, and linking ideas together, as well as how we can approach different topics, whether there are topics that we are comfortable writing about or topics that we are not comfortable writing about. In particular, how we should frame our written task as well. Now, first of all, before we begin, I'd like to let you guys know, for those of you doing IELTS, because of the problems that the world is facing with the coronavirus, it's really important that you, if you already have booked, or if you already knew where you were going to do your IELTS exam, you need to contact that IELTS center or that exam center. Now, if it's in Malta, it would be Malta Chamber. You need to contact it. You need to contact them and find out whether they are what they are doing, when you can do your test. Are they offering the opportunity to do online IELTS exams? And more importantly, another thing to contact is if you are doing the academic paper because you wanted to do a master's, for example, at university, you need to contact the university that you're going to find out from them what if they are making any if they're making any changes regarding the application, what is required, if they are making any allowances due to the coronavirus outbreak. So that's the first thing that I would like you guys to know. Make sure you are up to date with, one, the university you're going to go to, and two, the place that you intend to do your IELTS exam. So with that said, let's begin. So writing task part 2. As you know, this particular part of the exam is where you are going to be presented with a question, an essay, where you need to discuss. And from there, you need to try and put down different ideas on paper. And you don't have the amount of time that you would otherwise usually have in order to actually write an essay with very well thought out ideas, constructions. You can go over, read it again, make corrections. So you need to get what really will help you is your exam technique. Now, last time I briefly mentioned it, but what you're looking to do is you need to have about 4 to 5 paragraphs. Introduction, a middle body where you are discussing, and then finally a conclusion. At this point, I'm going to talk about something in relation of your type and your choice of language, especially when it comes to academic paper. Now, on one hand, you might be thinking, right, I need to show my language. I need to write down lots of different words, plenty of adjectives, plenty of adverbs, lots of different grammar. And that is one approach. But the important thing that there is a mistake with this. If you use unnecessary language, unnecessary adverbs, unnecessary adjectives, then that can become a problem. The reason being is that you can end up losing your coherence. Now, this is something very important, the term coherence. When we speak as a teacher of coherence, we are looking at how easy is it to follow what you are talking about? Or do we have to try and reread a sentence again and again to try and understand what you are talking about? So coherence and answering the question to begin with, this is your two most important things you need to tick. If you're answering all the question, or if you answer the question properly and you are coherent, you will automatically get a better mark. Because if you're coherent, it means the person can follow what you have written. The person can follow your ideas. They're not going to get confused with your line of thread. Now, then this comes on to your choice of your construction. Now, let's just go over a recap of your construction and how you can expand on your construction. Now, depending on your first language can make it a little bit of a difference. So if you know that you think and you write as if you're writing in your first language, you need to be aware of this, and you need to be aware of the differences. Now, my example here would be between Spanish and English. In Spanish, you could write, as far as I am aware, you can write, because you've got male and feminine, female and male and feminine, just masculine and feminine, just as you do in Italian, just as you do in French, for example. You can start your sentence without a pronoun, and you can go straight in with your verb, and you just have to make sure it's with an O or an A, for example. And this is a common thing we can see in English. People start their sentences without introducing the subject. So that's the first thing you guys need to remember. Make sure you have stated your subject. The next problem is knowing how to refer to your subject once you've introduced it. And that comes into the second part. Once you have introduced your subject of what you're talking about within a sentence, or for that matter, within a paragraph, you need to use the right pronoun. This is when we need to think of using pronouns such as it, or her, or she, or they. You also have to make sure you work on the basics, such as what type of sentences are you writing? So one of the things we can look at is how can we write certain sentences where we've got lots of different ideas. So that's the first thing I'm going to look at. I'm going to put my phone on silent because it keeps on buzzing. Right. Let's look at language structure. Now, there's something you need to be aware of in English, and that is this. Now, there are different types of clauses, but the clause I want to talk to you about is, first of all, foremost, independent clause. Okay? That's not coming up. Ah, that's why. Yes, I've written it. There we go. An independent clause. Now, an independent clause is when you can have a sentence that makes sense on its own. It's a perfectly good sentence, such as crime rate has risen over the past 10 years. Full stop. That would be an independent clause in the sense that it is a sentence on its own. Now comes for the next bit. A dependent clause. A dependent clause is a chunk of language that is not a sentence on its own. It depends on the independent clause. So the crime rate has risen over the past 10 years, which has led to people feeling unsafe. Now, you might be asking, wait a minute, is that just a relative clause? And the answer is yes. Yep, that is. That's because a relative clause takes on the formation and dependent clause. There are two different words for the same type of clause that we are talking about in this case. A relative clause is one form of a dependent clause. On its own, which has led to people feeling unsafe, is not a sentence on its own. So that is a dependent clause. It is also extra information. It is, from a grammatical point of view, it is also unnecessary. Now, how do we link ideas together when you've got, let's say you want to talk about three different things in one sentence? Your structure can be as follows. You've got an independent, you have an independent clause plus a dependent clause. Then you have to add one more type of clause. Now, in this case, you could make it independent, or you could make it a dependent clause. Either way, what's going to be really important is your way of linking language together. Independent. So, for example, the subject is crime. Crime rate has risen over the past 10 years, which has led to people feeling unsafe So the crime rate has risen over the past 10 years, which has led to people feeling unsafe, even though there are more police on the streets, streets. Okay? Here, what we've done is the crime rate has risen over the past 10 years, which has led to people feeling unsafe. Now, you can notice that you could put a full stop, even though there are more people on the streets. Now, what we've done here is, if you were to write, even though there are more police on the streets, that could potentially be a sentence on its own. So that would be an independent clause. So here, this is how we are linking our ideas together. You've got an independent clause. You've got an independent clause, followed by a dependent clause, followed by another independent clause. You will notice the really important thing here. Where do you put commas? And how do we continue the language after the comma? So if you're going to put a comma, this is where we're going to be thinking of different types of linking language. Now there are many types of linking language. This could be which, where, this could be whose, this could be and, for example. So you've got a range of possibilities. You just need to make sure that you're going with the correct linking word. After the next comma, that is when you then need to, again, link the next bit. And this is when we need to think of the type of language we're using when we are talking about, in any way, making a comparison that is slightly different. So as we can see here, the crime rate has risen over the past 10 years, which has led to people feeling unsafe, even though there are more police on the streets. What does even though mean? But having said that, despite, these are the linking words we can use when we are adding something that is in some way different to the previous clause, not sentence, clause. So this is the type of language we need to use when we're trying to link our ideas together. Now, the next thing we need to think about, now that we have an idea, is how long should a sentence really be? How many ideas should there be in one sentence? Well, for this, there's not a general answer, but I like to have a general rule that for the majority of the time, if my sentence has more than three clauses, or has three clauses, and has gone on for 3 lines, then I need to think about ending the sentence. You don't want ridiculously long sentences. It doesn't help. Again, it comes back to coherence and why English is a good language as a lingua franca. It's because you can say what you want to say in fewer words. That's one of the big differences between English and German. German sentences are known for being long. English sentences, in comparison, are much shorter or can be much shorter. So we need to bear this in mind. We need to remember that. Now, what's the other thing you guys need to remember? It's getting the basics right. The amount of times I see people making silly mistakes over very basic ideas, simple language. This is to do with articles, plural S's, plural S's. Actually, on the subject of plural itself, I'm going to make some time actually to talk about that because we need to think about our language when we're using a plural. There are formal words and there are informal plural nouns. For example, when do we say person? When do we say persons? And when do we say people? Well, obviously, person is singular, but then you've got two persons and people. When do we use people? When do we use persons? A good rule is most of the time you should be using people. You only use persons in a very specific formal environment. Mainly, you are using it in legal language. You are using it in catering or the hotel accommodation industry. Like, I would like a booking. How many persons? 8, please. You would use it in certain formal environments or with legal language, for example. But when you are just discussing general ideas or on the subject of general academic subjects, most of the time you can just simply use people. It is also the more native way of writing. So try and remember that. Unless if you're talking about something very specific or something legal, most of the time, you should probably just stick to people. And please do not make the mistake of writing peoples. It is not good. Now, articles. This is where you need to think about your first language. So if your first language is Russian, for example, or Turkish, or Japanese, or South Korean, for just to name a few, you don't have articles in your language. You don't have the, or an. They don't exist. This is where you need to really work hard on thinking in English. Now, you can often tell with a student when they have thought about a sentence in English and when they have thought about a sentence in their first language. What will happen is is, first of all, you will see the inconsistencies. So if I take a student from a country that doesn't have articles, if they have used articles correctly, I know that they have thought about that sentence, or I can be pretty sure they have thought about that sentence in English. If I see a sentence in the same bit of writing that does not have an article, it tells me that they probably did not necessarily think of that sentence, first of all, in English. It would then look like they translated it from their own language. This is also to do with word collocation and word order. This is particularly obvious when you're looking at Japanese students, South Korean students, Turkish students, and sometimes obviously Latin-speaking students as well, such as Spanish. If it's Spanish, for example, you can see the position of the article and the noun reversed. For example, they're the other way around. You can see it with Turkish. The structure of Turkish is very different to English, and you can see the words slight in English when you read it. It's not in the correct order. When your words are not in the correct order in English, that will affect your coherence. So the next thing you guys need to make sure you're doing when you are writing is think in English. And if you can't think of what you want to say in English because the sentence might be too difficult, think of how you can say it in English in a simpler way. Sometimes simpler can be better. It can be more effective. Sometimes less is more. These are the little tactics and strategies that you guys can use to your advantage, especially when you don't have a lot of time in an exam. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you guys about is owning the question. I briefly mentioned this last week, but I want to go into it a lot more. One of the most common things you will find in IELTS, the academic questioning of IELTS, is generic statements, very general. And with this, it can become a little bit difficult to have a consistent, what we call a consistent thread, meaning you can start off at the introduction, you can work all the way through the main body, finish at the conclusion, and you know what the person has spoken about. So one of the most important things you can do is the introduction. You need to get this right. So I'm just going to get a question from IELTS, task 3. And we're going to explore it together. And in doing so, we're going to have a little look at how we can, what I describe as owning the question. So let's see. Okay, here we go. Let's go with global warming. Okay. A nice generic question that everybody, a nice generic question, a typical IELTS question. So should the international community do more to tackle the threat of global warming? Right. So if your first answer and your first thought is to write something on the lines of, yes, the international community need to do more to tackle the threat of global warming, that's not going to help you. In fact, I would tell you avoid it. Global warming is a very general topic. There are lots of aspects of it. To take ownership, choose 3 aspects of the general topic. Now, to give you an idea of what I'm really talking about, Global warming, if I am looking at it from a teacher's language perspective, is called a lexical set. A lexical set is the topic. What you need to then think of is something called a lexical chain. This approach will also help you with reading. A lexical chain are words that are in some way linked to the topic, that are linked to the lexical set. So if global warming is the lexical set, the lexical chain can be subtopics of that. It can be sub-issues of that. This is what you need to think of. You need to think of at least 3 key lexical chains that are linked to the topic of global warming. Now, what would this be? Right, let's start off with something like fishing, plastic, and the third one you can probably look at is poverty. 3 very general things that are all linked to global warming. You could change that one of them. You could go with oil, you could go with deforestation. There are so many lexical sets of, there are so many lexical chains, so many different lexical chains with the lexical set. Now, how do you then go about writing about it? How do you try to bring all of these threads and ideas together? It's quite simple in an IELTS exam. You've got global warming. You might even decide, wait a minute, 3 might be too much. What if I just went with 2? Okay, let's say we choose 2. With 2, you could go with, for example, sea pollution, for example. And that still brings in like plastic, for example. So that's good. That's a good start. And then the other one is to do with certain types of industries. Maybe you might be looking to talk about, let's say, again, I think what would make even more sense is if you tie it in with something like plastic, for example. Okay, so you've got 2 things that are then connected. So you've got your global warming, which, or you could change that for climate change, for example, and then that's your lexical set. From there, in your introduction, you're going to narrow it down. You're going to try and talk about sea pollution and plastic as a contributing factors to global warming or climate change. So how do you do this in terms of the introduction? How can we construct this? I'm going to give you an example. So global warming is a current issue that concerns the world. Two aspects that need to be addressed regarding the issue are our attitudes and policies to sea pollution and plastic. Sea pollution and the production of plastic. Okay. Now, in doing so, what we've done is first we're addressing the question. Now, the first sentence is almost, I would even say, that could be reworded. But you've got global warming is a current issue that concerns the world. 2 aspects that need to be addressed regarding the issue. Notice, I have not repeated global warming. I have replaced global warming with the term issue. Otherwise, it would be unnecessary repetitive action, repetitive words. 2 aspects that need to be addressed regarding the issue. are our attitudes and policies to sea pollution and the production of plastic. Therefore, in your introduction, you've already stated that these are the two issues you are going to focus on, that you are going to address. Now, address is look at. Okay? That you are going to address in your essay. This then helps you because now you from having lots of ideas in your head, you can now think of, right, I've got my paragraph 1, that's the introduction. I've said that, okay, we're going to address global warming, but in particular, I'm going to look at 2 aspects that are related to global warming. Great. Now, you've got 2 more paragraphs for your, or 3 more paragraphs for your discussion section. This is where you can then break it up to discussing, right, the first paragraph is going to be about sea pollution, and the second paragraph is going to be about the production of plastic. There's a nice flow of it because obviously sea pollution and plastic, there's a connection, there's a direct, easy connection to make, and that can then lead on to my conclusion. So this is a clear structure that instantly makes a question like this become so much easier to answer. Now, I'm going to give you a different example. So we're going to go with a different question, so we can have a look at the way we can go about our introductions. So here is another question. So the question is, oh, it's probably too long. I'm going to break it up. So there's actually 2 parts to this question. Social media is becoming increasingly popular amongst all age groups. However, sharing personal information on social media websites does have risks. Media websites do have risks. Do you think that the advantages of social media outweigh the disadvantages? Okay. Now, the great thing about that question, it already tells you what you need to look at. You need to look at the advantages and disadvantages. But social media, again, it's a very, very broad topic. There's lots of different social media websites. There's lots of different ways social media is used. So the lexical set is social media. Okay, so if we were to think of lexical chain language, this is where we can start thinking of actual social media websites, such as Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Snapchat, Twitter. This is when you decide to pick your categories, your type of categories of social media websites. So are you going to go with generic, really popular ones? Are you going to go with social media websites that are to do with news? Are you going to do it with personal communication? Are you going to do things with music, gaming? It's a really, really broad area. So if this were me, I would decide, right, do you think the advantages of social media outweigh the disadvantages? What am I going to choose? I'm going to look at social media websites that are probably the most popular and are perhaps the ones that need to be spoken about the most. So, for example, you could go with, you could actually even brand this entire social media lexical chain that follows just with social media platforms that are owned by Facebook, because then you've got WhatsApp, Facebook, and Instagram. So that gives you 3 different platforms to talk about, and 3 very different platforms. You've got one which is extremely visual, more photo-based, video-based, such as Instagram. You've got the more traditional social media one where you get to write long texts, sharing news articles, as well as creating, that social event. And then you've got WhatsApp, which basically replaces text messaging, really. So there automatically you've got your really good lexical chain. On the other hand, you might just decide to pick on two major competitors, such as you might decide to go with Twitter and Facebook. You might decide, right, let's just look at those two. Just like we did with global warming, you then need to think of your introduction. So, how can we introduce an idea where you've got advantages and disadvantages? Social media. Social media has many positives as well as negatives. As far as as for weather, the advantages now let's paraphrase. As for whether the advantages exceed the downside or the disadvantages. As for whether the advantages exceed the disadvantages, we have to consider platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. So I'll read that again. Social media has many positives as well as negatives. You'll notice that instead of using advantages and disadvantages, I've gone with synonyms. As for whether the advantages exceed the disadvantages, again, I've gone with a different word to outweigh. Same meaning, just a synonym. We have to consider platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. Again, in your introduction, you have now owned the sentence. The examiner can then read this and instantly knows, right, the guy can see, right, okay, the person is going to be talking about social media, obviously, but in particular, the person's going to focus on the advantages and disadvantages related to social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter. Easy to follow, and it means then with your discussion part, it makes it a lot easier for you to put your thoughts down on paper. And that is the exam technique. Now, what about the conclusion? We'll leave the body for another time because we only have 20 minutes left. The conclusion can be a little bit tricky. You might think that you can start your sentence with "to conclude," and yes, you could do, but it's not the best phrase to introduce a conclusion. First of all, with your conclusion, you don't want to be introducing any new ideas. You want to be summarizing the discussion part. So what sort of phrases can we use? So, in short, so instead of "to conclude," you can say "in short." Taking into account the arguments above. That's another one. When you say taking into account, it means thinking about what you have discussed or what you have argued in your body. Obviously, there are others, such as in summary. What else? What would be another one? Considering the discussion above, this is very similar to taking into account the arguments above. So these are phrases you can use to introduce your conclusion. And then from there, you don't want it to be too long. You want it to be a short paragraph that nicely summarizes the arguments. Here you have to, this is where if you are going to put in your opinion, this is where you put your opinion in. You might think you should be writing in in the first person, I think, I believe, blah, 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 that sort of language. I should say on the subject of the discussion, it's better to use slightly different language than I. When you are in the discussion section of your essay, try and use slightly different language, such as instead of I think, for example, instead use things like it can be, go with the passive, it can be argued, it can be said. This type of language, you're not saying this is necessarily your opinion, but you're using the passive to introduce different ideas. And that's part of the thing. If you're going to be talking about advantages and disadvantages, the discussion section needs to be discussing it, not just your opinion. Your opinion can wait for the end, basically. Another thing to do with your conclusion. This is where your language probably needs to be simpler than what you've previously used before. You don't want to overly complicate your conclusion either. It needs to be a nice summary that simply states, for instance, in short, though social media has both positives and negatives, overall, it would seem, now this I will talk about, it would seem that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages because of arguments presented to do with socializing and getting people to stay in contact, especially during periods such as the current crisis, for example. Now, again, how do you state an opinion without just saying I? This is where we can use the term seem. It would seem, or it seems to me. So you've got it seems to me, it would seem. It basically is replacing the word or the phrase it looks like, or what it looks like to me. So I'll give you an example. I will write this in. In short, the arguments for social media being the arguments for social media, in short, the arguments for social media being largely more positive than negative seem, so looks like, to ensure the arguments for social media being largely more positive than negative seem to be the case. So that could be your introduction sentence, your introductory sentence to your conclusion. In short, the arguments for social media being largely more positive than negative seem to be the case. Or you could say seem to be more likely, for example. Full stop. Here you are in fact stating your opinion, but you're not resorting to saying I think or in my opinion, because if we are using that language, as much as it's something that you can use when discussing verbally, try and avoid it in writing. We do tend to write differently in English than the way we speak, and using language like this is better. So when you use the word it seems, or it would seem, this is effectively another way of saying I think, or it looks like, or in my opinion. Okay. Second. I can hear you. Okay, someone's just on the sofa. Okay, so that's the idea. Okay, good. We still have enough time to do actually to look at the main body of the writing. So let's look at the main body of the writing. How do we layer it? We've got a few options in terms of how to layer it. I'm going to go with two examples. You can either introduce an idea with some form of a conditional based structure, or you can go with discourse language, such as firstly, first of all, however, having said that. Now, using discourse language is quite a good way of doing it. You can start off by saying firstly. Um, um, you can go with what else? Regarding. That's a good one. Regarding the positives, and then you continue your sentence. So you've got language like this. In the discussion section, you could go with on one hand, on the other hand. That being said, which is a way you would start a sentence, and it basically means but. However, if you want to show a high level of writing, go with stating the argument straight away. So, for example, you can start off with the modal verb should, replacing the word if, and you take on a conditional structure. So, should social media have more positives than negatives? We would have to see, we would have to evaluate. Let's go with a better word, evaluate. We'd have to evaluate. Now, evaluate is the same thing as examine. We would have to evaluate whether sites such as Facebook bring people closer together rather than, yeah, actually, that would be unnecessary language if we say more. So we don't want to say anything unnecessary. So should social media have more positives than negatives, we would have to evaluate whether sites such as Facebook bring people closer together. That's a really good way of introducing arguments where you're going to discuss the positives. Then what about if you're going to bring in, let's say, the flip side of things? You could go with, you can actually move on to the next bit by asking a question that you're then going to discuss. So, for example, you could say, a question we need to consider is whether um, people are using Twitter and Facebook to we're using Twitter and Facebook to using Twitter and Facebook. A question we need to consider is whether people are using Twitter and Facebook to spread fake news. Now, that is a really good way of then starting your negatives, and you can do this and it doesn't need to be negative. You can start your line of discussion with either presenting a question or presenting an idea that you need to look at, such as with a conditional. So should social media have more positives than negatives, we would have to evaluate whether sites such as Facebook bring people closer together. Actually, that should be a question mark at the end. So overall, you can go with your conditional, you can go with a standard-based question, but the great thing about going in with some kind of question at the start of your discussion is, again, it helps you direct your answers, because then because you have asked a question that is to do with the actual topic and discussion, it helps you to focus on answering that question. This helps you with coherence. This helps you by writing coherently, because then in that one paragraph, you just need to answer the question that you've asked. That is, goes back to your main topic. Let's consider global warming, for example. The question that can be asked, notice the passive, the question that can be asked regarding sea pollution is whether or not cruise ships are responsible. There you go. You can now answer. Again, you're talking about sea pollution. Let's narrow this down even further. Now let's talk about cruise ships pollution, cruise ships and sea pollution, because sea pollution is still broader. What are we doing? The entire process for the written task part 2 is to make things smaller and smaller and smaller, narrower, narrower, narrower. The narrower you make your line of discussion, the easier it is for you to answer the question. And on top of that, it's easier for you to make sure that what you're writing is coherent. We can then follow it. The biggest mistake you can make is not actually doing any of the steps that I've mentioned today. Because if you simply go in and try to write your ideas on paper, there's no way an examiner is going to be able to follow. This is why, if you follow these sort of steps whereby you take the main question and you slowly make the size of the question smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, it makes it easier to answer. It gives you the real opportunity to write a very good essay. It shows coherence, it shows that you're answering the question, and it also helps you with the type of language you're going to use. So think of the type of question you've asked. If you are using some kind of conditional sentence as your question, that's really good. It shows that you are not just using a conditional, but you're using it in the right way. And this goes on to my final point. Any grammar you choose to use, make sure you're using it in the right way, the right context. This is why sometimes the simpler grammatical points are really big ticks. You can get you a lot of marks. It's just a question of how you link ideas together, how you link your sentences together, which we looked at the start of the session when we were talking about dependent and independent clauses. So that is my advice and lesson on the written task part 2. I hope you have found this lesson helpful, and if you think anyone else would find this helpful, please share this with friends. If you have any questions, please ask me in the description in the comment section below, and I will do my best to answer. Once again, I would like to remind you guys that if you are here because if you're planning to do the IELTS exam, get in touch with both the university that you're looking to go to, if it's to do with, like, let's say, applying for a master's, and get in touch with the place where you intend to do your exam. You need to find out what they are doing during this period. And whether or not there is the option to sit online, any online tests as well. So thank you very much. Have a really good afternoon. Have a very good day. I hope all of you are keeping safe. Well, I hope all of you are safe. And if you want to send me any ideas or if you want to try and answer some of these questions that we looked at today, please do. I will leave a link in the description below later of a really good website that you guys can go to find lots of good questions where you can practice writing as well. So thank you very much, guys. Have a great day. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't already subscribed, and I will see you next time. Now, regarding next time, I think that's going to be Friday afternoon. Friday afternoon is going to be an upper intermediate, IELTS, and advanced YouTube live lesson. So tune in for that. Join me then. That will be 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. See you Friday.